it's surprisingly a personal tale, along with being a pretty global tale as well. Uh, it's the story is mainly told from the point of view of an activist, Rigoberta Menchú, who won a Nobel Peace Prize in the later in her life. She was only 23 when she did this film, and she shows a lot of courage and resilience through her narration in telling her part of the story. And just to start off here, I'd like to hear your initial reactions from the film. I know Mohammed hasn't seen it. Supreet, Tanmay, and Nikhil. I think let's start off with Supreet. Can you give us a small, capsulated take on what you felt after watching the documentary?
Sure. And this film felt. I'm audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. This film felt more like social commentary than. I don't know. It is social documentary, sure, but it felt like you're talking about average life for everyone. Like, it's a thing global. Like, the natives who come to work in the newly developing cities and how they often ill treated and abused, and while rich people benefited of them, and then criticize them for not doing it. They're part of the share for developing the country. This felt like a bit of those kinds of lines in the earlier parts of the film.
Hmm.
And I expected to see a lot of violence and gore, like at least like in the last Cambodian. What was it again? Forgot the name. Sorry. Yeah,
The missing picture.
yeah, the missing picture. So I expected to see more like a murder, or the like someone being taken to forest and killed, or how like exact, but without the clay here, like just with people, archive footage and all. Didn't see any of that, to be honest. So I was a bit disappointed actually in that matter. I expected it to be more of a genocide, killing, butchering people and all that. Expect this went more of a social commentary and social like way of life of people doing the what was it, the Guatemalan rule and everything. It was new, but it felt a bit more that's like a documentary we just seen history TV 18. If that's what you can relate it to. That's all.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a fair. I mean, takeaway. I mean, I for one was still shook by the descriptions uh, of violence in the film, specifically like to mention a scene towards the middle where Rigoberta talks about how her brother was taken by the army and well tortured and so on. Like if I think I had the opposite reaction. I'm someone who's in general very queasy about violence in films. And but yeah, even but here I felt not showing it sort of was made it a lot more powerful, and it it took away from what could have been spectacular. I'm sure missing picture also achieved this in a similar way by having it be a animated film, right? So it's a pretty interesting choice. I think with the next couple of coming weeks, we'll also see a couple more subversions of how to depict this on film, right? Especially when you're talking about real people and their real lives and experiences. So, yeah. Tanmay, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So from what I've watched, I've watched almost 85% of the documentary. So to me, it felt closer to Nero's Guests rather than something like Schindler's List or something. Okay. At least the style and like they said, they didn't show that much. They didn't. It wasn't more like a horror porn or something. It was a very subtle way of showing and horrifying you. And I'm not really sure from a filmmaking perspective how uh, effective it would have been if they showed the violence, uh, but as it is, it's extremely chilling, and
Yeah.
yeah. So something that yeah, I don't know why it really makes me, compare it to something like Nero's guests, the whole earnestness and the heart, the of the of the activist, their it's like the spirit. I can compare it to somebody like P Sainath, talking in Nero's guests about the agrarian distress, right? The same, it's different kinds of issues, right? But I think from my experience watching it, that's the closest, you know, uh, that's the most similar. That's what I feel anyway. I haven't watched many others. So, yeah. And another, yeah. You were saying something, Jeffrey?
No, 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 I was just agreeing with your point. Uh, and anything else you wanted to mention?
Yeah. So, uh, it again, it gives me a lot of parallels between the Naxalite movement in India, you know it's extremely similar to this, to that. And if you read about the Naxalite movement, you'll see that all the Maoists, the foot soldiers of the Maoists, they are tribals from, facing the same sort of oppression, right, from the Indian paramilitary forces and the police forces. And I am so yeah. So I see a lot of parallels between our movement and theirs, and for the same reasons as well. Because the government wants to displace the tribals and give the land to corporate interests. Same with United Fruit in Guatemala. So they're chillingly similar. Is all I'd say.
That was very well put. Nero's guests, right? The talking. I think it's about the agrarian crisis here in the Northeast, right? I'll.
It's about so I think in Maharashtra,
Hmm,
it's yeah, there was a drought, I think, in 2004 to 7 or something like that. So it was
okay.
shot during that time. And it documents the extensive farmer suicides. All right. So P.
Yeah.
Sainath, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of him, is one of India's most reputed journalists. He is mainly works in documenting the lives of people in rural India, right? So in Nero's guests, they talk about how government apathy and downright maliciousness causes the death, the such wide ranging agrarian distress, and causes multiple deaths in a family of farmers, right? They talk about how the father commits suicide, the burden goes on to the son commits suicide, and so on, right? So here again, I felt the parallel to the between these two, mainly because of the way it is shown. They don't
Hmm,
really show uh, the gore, okay, whereas they put it eloquently. And one scene especially hits home, right? So in this documentary, they show the beauty pageant around somewhere in the middle, okay,
yeah.
organized by the elite for the elite, where they show their own country's cultures to a very disconnected elite, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
uh, so and it's a beauty pageant. And a similar line in Nero's guests, where P. Sainath says he goes to, extensively speaks about the agrarian distress in a scene, and then he says that, look, there's two good news this year. The number of rupee billionaires in India has doubled the past year. And number two, Lakme Fashion Week, we're going to have two of them this year. So this is the greatest news you can hear, in a very sort of sarcastic tone. And then they show how the Indian elite, right? They themselves, it's very chillingly similar. The Indian elite go to this Lakme Fashion Week and so on, and they see their own culture being shown to them. And you also hear vacuous statements from them, like, they're partying, and they're taking money, and they're trying to feel good about being rich and donating and so on, okay. So again, that also shows a very distinct disconnect between the elite and the ground reality, right? The ground reality in Nero's case being the farmer suicides, as compared to the elite's, indulgence. Similarly, in this, the scene is also quite similar. It's a fashion pageant and a beauty pageant, quite.
Yeah.
So I think that scene also kind of cemented my opinion that it's very close to Nero's guests. So
That
yeah.
was very well put. I'll add it to some of our footnotes for post the discussion. Uh, and yeah, like I think this also speaks to what I felt was another quality that the film had. It had despite being created from archival footage, I don't think the filmmakers were too focused on the details, right? The ground level details. Uh, it was crafted, I mean, it was framed in a more abstract, I mean, I wouldn't say abstract, but in a more oppressor. I mean, here's the oppressor, here's the people who are being oppressed. This is the ground reality for them, and it kept it pretty simple there. And it sort of, I felt it was more like, as far as documentaries go, this is some of the more evocative, I suppose, that I've seen in recent times. So yeah, and I think P. Sainath has a similar style in doc his work as well. I haven't watched Nero's guests to comment, but we can have this later as well. So who's next? Nikhil, do you want to talk about your take on the film and why you chose it for the curation now?
Yeah. We actually wanted to, Vishal and I wanted to explore a film documentary that not only spoke volumes about the current exploitation that is going on, but also centuries of oppression that led up to it. With the Rwandan genocide, with the Holocaust, and the Cambodian genocide, you have you have a pretty clear picture of where it starts and what it leads to. For example, with the Hutus and the Tutsis, have a we have a straightforward familiarity with where it starts, although it also stretches out through history. But this, particularly the Mayan extermination and the perpetual oppression of the native Indian community, it's been the norm ever since Christopher Columbus or Amerigo, essentially set foot on the American islands, and it hasn't stopped, and ever since then, and it keeps going on. Even right now, there are a lot of, there is a lot of government intrusion into Native American land for the purposes of gas lines and whatnot. And something of this sort seemed inevitable. Something of a clash between the government funded by a capitalist overlord and the oppressed. The clash seemed inevitable, and that was what we wanted to highlight. We actually thought of looking at genocides from various government systems, because governments have a strong role in either actively participating in it or actively curbing it, as we are seeing with our current status in our own country. So this
Uh,
seemed like a very interesting. Sorry.
Tanmay raised his hand.
Yeah, Tanmay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just curious.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't know how, if it will come across as disrespectful or not. It's just that, so I was just thinking from a very academic point of view,
Mhm.
if we can call this a genocide along the lines of the Holocaust, or if it has more in common with the Naxalite movement and the experience of the tribals, which I don't think that it's technically not a genocide. I mean, no, that's why I said I don't want to be disrespectful to the suffering.
That's a
Just that.
very fair question. It's owing to how loose the very definition of genocide is. A pogrom and a genocide are mass killing. It's not really something that is as standardized as a lot of other definitions in natural sciences. So it's understandable. So with genocides, you have voluntary um, uh, I'm looking
Admission, like documentation around.
not documentation, but you have a voluntary uh, aim of um, uh, sorry,
Yeah, it's okay.
so-
I think what Nikhil is trying to say is something more along the lines of this is like the oppressors here are trying to eradicate
exactly
a huge
eradicate
section. Yeah.
a section or a community. A section or a community where they are distinguished particularly based on their religious practices or their uh, uh, ethnic affiliations. And here you have that with the Mayans. And
Okay.
Mayans is an umbrella term for a lot of Native Americans, where you have distinct tribes, and that is where the aspect of genocide, in some sense, takes shape.
Okay.
They have
Supreet,
this.
you had a point. Do you want to speak up?
Yeah. Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I just was searching Google right now for definitions in his side. Okay, because I was curious about this matter, and I
Mhm.
found out that there isn't any standardized argument for the academic definition of genocide. But consider here, okay, Oxford language, the definition is murder of all people. Or the same thing if I search for in UN United Nations genocide prevention website, it's more detailed,
Mhm.
but it's based on a statute of some law of a criminal code, not
Mhm.
so intentional criminal code.
Mhm.
So the the technical genocide term isn't properly defined. Where in the, for example, UN, it was more killing members or causing mental and bodily harm, or in affecting group conditions on people,
Mhm.
or even prevention of births as well as forcibly transferring children and women to other places.
Mhm.
While this sounds more like what happened in the Holocaust or anything, but uh, but considering this can also be the same thing if you're thinking in the case of a Britain in 1940s, like how they transport children and women for safety to outside London and everything else. But for this case is I don't think a genocide will be the right word. We can call it social exodus, if we can call that social uh, possibly removing a community from the entire.
Exoduses are usually accompanied after, and I mean, usually before. I mean, sometimes before, but usually after a genocide of this sort.
Yeah, but
And yeah, go on, go on.
yeah, like social exodus, as like people are and culture is repressed, is more like culture is repressed and people are forced to be they're excluded, and they're they some like, and they're degraded to a society which is doesn't even care about them. They live on the natives land, they feed on the natives, they feed on the natives, but they don't care about them, so they ignored and disregarded. So in that way, and these natives have to adapt because the main funders, the main contributors, the main reason they can stay alive right now is the ignorant or the ignorant, like the unconcerned elite. So I think that's why I call it exodus more than sure, my definition is a bit wonky, but that's what I feel.
Um, um, there are a few points they use to classify, uh, mass killing as a genocide, and that particularly reflects on what kind of what was the agenda of the oppressors. And here it was very clear that although they were trying to be indiscriminate in some degree, they It was mostly on the Mayan civilization, particularly because they had a certain lifestyle and they occupied lands in certain areas where United Fruit had a vested interest. And Holocaust and the Guatemalan genocide, they weigh very differently in terms of the you know systematic uh, uh, the systematic extermination of Jews, and probably not as systematic extermination of the Mayans, but you have the core elements that lead up to it, and that is what qualifies it as a genocide in some degree. Although the magnitudes might be very different and the government involvement might be very different, but the agenda tends to be the same.
Also the ratio is different, right? This is a more indigenous community
Yeah.
than
And the killing is pretty stretched out through the years.
yeah.
The reason why the Holocaust was so horrific was because it was done over a very short period of time. And I think it's the same with the Rwandan genocide as well, because in about 100 days they managed to kill about 1 million people.
Yeah, so the I think it's more to do with like if you I don't know how the categorization works entirely, but I think it has more to do with the population and the ratio of it, and then the means and the intentions used to kill them, right? Uh,
Intention is a very is the driving force here.
yeah, intention is intention being the biggest factor, and the others being more to do with quantitative measures, right?
Yeah,
Quantitative,
exactly.
yeah,
And
yeah, but
also one problem. It's not a problem, but it's not a problem for us, but it's a problem for the social scientists, wherein they don't really have a generally agreed upon definition. I think this happens with in many aspects of psychology as well, where you have different schools of thought exploring a particular problem from different angles. So usually the definition, in some sense, holds the key to the direction of the discussion.
okay. So I guess that sort of wraps up this thing, right? I think we either ways. I mean, I think even going by, I just looked this up
Mhm.
around some up to somewhere between 42,000 to 166,000 deaths have been recorded along this period. Like the genocide. I mean, this particular one was from 1981 to 83, right? 3 years.
Yeah.
It was also dubbed as the silent holocaust uh,
Mm.
because of the because of how much came to light much later. I think also considering the time this came out, and this documentary came out in 1983. This also coincided with Rigoberta's book, memoir, which also came out around the same time, and both these efforts in turn uh, helped bring this particular narrative to the public, and uh, helped her with her eventual like Nobel Peace Prize win later on. I don't know if you can call it a win, but sorry about that. Then yeah, so coming back to the film, I found it very interesting. This was my first time watching it, as in I'm not so exposed to documentaries of this nature, or uh, I mean works of this nature that cover systemic violence on such a I, I don't know and on this particular scale. I don't know if big or small can be used uh, lightly here. So yeah, I what I found, I think from I generally I try to look for something personal in whatever I watch, something personal in the sense, some personal elements, some, be it a narrator, be it a, be it the way the film was picturized, or the events depicted, uh, something that helps me stay grounded, or try to find some connect with the film. And with documentaries, it's a lot more. Uh, Usually, documentaries are shot in a more detached manner, right? The I mean, the one of the intentions behind the making is to retain your objectivity, right? It's spawned from the cinema verite movement in a way. So it took that from the cinema verite movement, and I found in a way, this film is a two-in-one film, right? It has, on one hand, you have Rigoberta's testimony or her narration, uh, giving you this first person view of how these events were, how these events played out throughout the film. The And then you have I suppose, the Pamela Yates, Newton Thomas Sigel version of the events, where they talk about what happened in what happened in Guatemala. We get close up conversations with the U.S. ambassador and the general and the president. We get a huge scene in the middle of in the first half of the film about the general and his activities, his role in the evangelist, in the American sponsored evangelist community there. We get a more global picture, and this, in a way, I felt this also brought a little, I wouldn't I don't know if cinematic is the right word, but it brought a more active role, active sense to, I mean, uh, there was something more of an active pace, or something to call this, for the way, in the way the things played out on screen, right? um, I want to talk a little bit about that, and what each of you got out of the film. Also, in the lead up to this discussion, we kind of posted a chapter Rigoberta's book, of an excerpt from her memoir, that talks about her times, the time she spent, uh, working for one of the rich families uh, in town at the time, and how that how those experiences in a way personally fueled her need to get into to stand up for her people and get into activism. So I was hoping you could get some comments on that. Starting with Nikhil.
Yeah, could you give me a summarized point of that?
Yeah, so the storytelling aspect of the film. The film had a almost fable. I wouldn't say fable, but it had that. It had the sections with the activist where she talks about uh, all the experiences of her people and so on. Her experiences and the experiences of people and so on.
Yeah. So there was a sense of verite in terms of the way it was structured. I mean, there was a push for objectivity, but it was also, in some sense, challenged with the personal take by Roberta, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly.
Yeah,
Uh, so
we can stick to her surname also, if that's like, I know her first name is a bit too like it's a bit hard to pronounce. So
yeah,
Manchu, yeah, Miss
yes.
Manchu would work as well. Yeah,
So I mean, the aspect of the challenge between subjectivity and objectivity at this point seemed interesting, which is why, although you had this observational documentary setup throughout, I'm supposing there were only a few elements that were studio produced. Outside of that, you didn't really have a studio influence on the entirety of the documentary, which was essentially it hits all the checkpoints in the cinema verite movement characteristic checklist. Um, can you repeat the question? I mean, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, like the film had a dual narrative thing going on. That's
Yeah.
all. One was a personal one, and one was
Yeah.
a test. One was a very personal one, and the other was far more objective one. I think one something more akin to what we see in documentaries in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I like I'll just take. I was surprised in the way the both were interweaved and how they worked in hand in hand with each other. Because a general criticism we see from documentaries made by Americans or white people about in marginalized communities is that they tend to be a bit more. They tend to be a very exoticized, or they tend to be some level of sensationalism added to the narrative, and I didn't see that here. In a way, I mean, in a way, it's also comments on that kind of coloring, right? That kind of layering with the pageant scenes
True.
in the film. So it was interesting. It was kind of interesting to note that, it was also one of the things that tick me off about documentaries of this nature is that they tend to be a bit more. They tend to be a little tone deaf in this regard when it comes to depicting a particular not. Depicting a particular community, especially with, I think there's a huge discussion about this with Indians, right? With how the Indians are depicted in American produced films or foreign produced films, foreign productions. So yeah, I found this, and also read much later that the one of the directors, Pamela Yates, had made another two documentaries on the Guatemala on the Guatemala genocide or the revolution rather in the years to come in the next 20 years. Uh, One of it being Granito, uh, and one of the notable ones being Granito, which has which covers the efforts of her from her side of getting all this archival footage and trying to provide process this as evidence for a war crimes tribunal in order to prosecute the generals and all the people involved in the Guatemalan genocide shown here. So
Interestingly, this documentary was also used in the international court, I suppose, as a piece of evidence.
yeah. So I mean, so Granito covers that effort. It kind of covers that how that whole story was told. And there was also another one made much later on. I think that one's called 500 Years.
Oh,
That covers the actual trial, from what I understand. I haven't watched the third one, but the second one is definitely worth. I mean, if you guys, it's like it works as a. I don't know if epilogue is the right word, but some sense of renewed justice, retrospective justice, is seen in this film. So yeah, but any thoughts on the story, the way the story was told from you guys, Supreet, Tanmay? The filmmaking aspects of it.
the filmmaking aspects actually had a lot of resonance from the early, early 1960s or 1950s eras where you had a couple of documentary filmmakers just uh, you know staying in certain locations and following the if I may the protagonists in air quotes around. So there was this very famous documentary on John F. Kennedy when he was probably during the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'm not sure who the documentary filmmaker was, but it's a pretty famous documentary. I think if you Google it, you might be able to find it.
Yeah. Well, I'm familiar with the name. I think there are like so many documentaries about him. I keep forget
No,
which one is which.
I think
Yeah.
this documentary is particularly about him in the White House.
Cuban.
Yeah,
Okay.
in the White House, he's seen having discussions. He's seen, going about probably having a cup of coffee, etc. The mundanity and the severity, both of
Hmm.
them captured. So it had some of those elements when she goes out and in some sense interviews with a very small team, which is what I was talking about. It hits all the checklists on the cinema verite characteristics, and
Yeah.
mm, I think let me collect my thoughts. I think the
Yeah.
you can.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I'll Supreet, you raised your hand earlier. Would you like to add a point?
Yeah, I'm audible.
Yeah,
Yeah. Hello.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Okay. So as you know, Nikhil was saying, there's a bit. I had a bit. I'll search Google for subjectivity and objectivity. I my thoughts in Google for that. Well, this film was more of and I can pardon me for saying, but more of a aesthetic view. Like you get to know what the Guatemalan crisis, understand and everything, but you presented it more of uh, a large scale omnipresent view. Now, a person of higher authority, like the American leaders or the Guatemalan general, for example, in first half, and the personal story by Robert. Okay, I don't remember the last name, but Robert.
I'll
So this
mention. Yeah.
Mencho, yeah, whatever. So this actually reminded me of the personal part of a story. Actually, reminded me a bit about Boy in the Striped Pajamas and White Tiger by Arvind Adiga. No, those kinds of books. No, which had a bit of a personal view. They talked about society. They talked about how social inequality, like in Arvind Adiga White Tiger. He talked about
Hmm.
how social inequality and how this local village boy had to fight for his living and all that. In the
Yeah.
end, he murdered his way to power, like whatever he did to power. But uh, that stays like he the social inequality, like how he was nobody in village and how he was to be a driver for the rich couple. Then goes on and on and that. So that reminded me of this in the when talking about subjectivity and objectivity in the discussion.
Hmm.
And wait a minute. And one more thing, this film, like, yeah, this film actually, pardon me, I had one more point. I remember and tell you. 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Continue.
Yeah. No problem. No problem. Uh.
So
So. Hmm.
one addition I wanted to make regarding the copy that I guess we watched, and so this the 2004 digitally remastered version. It also had an interview with Susan Sarandon, and it had a different kind. It had an epilogue, tracking the movements. I mean, tracking the changes ever since the documentary was originally shot. And additionally, the investigation in some sense confirmed a significant mistake in the documentary, blamed the army for a village massacre that was actually been carried out by the EGP.
Oh. Okay.
So I think that was one correction that Yates herself wanted the documentary to point out in some degree.
Hmm. It's kind of interesting to see, like coming to the this thing, right? With some inconsistencies, it was kind of interesting to see how voiceovers and subtitles were used in the film to uh, to to convey to the audience what the characters were talking about. Uh, I and like I have a few thoughts on this because I this is one of the things I looked up. Like I specifically looked for uh, in the audio commentary. Actually, in the lead up to this session, I kind of did some homework there. I went through the audio commentary of the film, which our copy came with,
Mm-hmm.
and I came to know that both Yates and Siegel didn't know Spanish at the time. Spanish, or I forgot what the actual language. Mayan uh, Mayan people ka language was. It's another thing altogether. But yeah, they didn't know the language at the time, and the translator they had along with them on set intentionally he would misquote them in
Okay.
order
What
to sort
was
of
the
censor the censor their witnesses, right? Because these people hello.
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah. So in a way, like, because government sentiments was against them at the time, right? Their efforts, and most of the folks who would end up assisting the production team tend to be from a slightly higher economic class, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So they would bring their own biases into the mix, and misquote, not intentionally misquote them, bring along, try to deviate from this whole thing. I think they were there for I don't remember seeing a record of how long the production was,
Mm-hmm.
but from what I understand, they were there for a whole for close to a summer, or like the whole section that was detailed. I think some 6 months of footage is what's shown in the film, right? I mean,
Yep.
some 6 months of events, right? This is, I mean, you have the recreated footage between the ambassador and the uh, president, which happens a lot earlier. But apart from that, all the things that happen in the film happen in a very short frame of time. I mean, short frame of time in the sense compared to other films, like even though compared to what it aims to also do, right? By showing the bureaucratic stuff that led to this in the first place. Uh, so yeah, it was interesting to see how subtitles and voiceovers were used in that. What they did was they had another person translate it during the editing process. They
Mm-hmm.
had a, no, they had, I think they got in touch with some four to six people to individually to translate all the dialogues for them, translate all the, not dialogues, the accounts or the witness accounts for them, so that
Mm-hmm.
they can get it just right. And it's kind of interesting how that much sense uh, uh, of objectivity, or just how that much dedication was shown through an effort like this, because usually documentaries don't tend to get that much uh, that level of that level of careful detailing. Or even in this case, the voiceovers were only used for the people in the more oppressive propositions, uh, not for the actual people, not for the Mayan people, not for the people were um who were victims, like who had to go through this, which was also another interesting thing I took away from the film.
It's
Um,
actually quite a, yeah, that's a really nice observation. I hadn't spotted that. That gives a new perspective on how to use
yeah,
this.
yeah, there was quite, like, even if it's a documentary, there was quite. I mean, quite even if nay, even for a documentary, for a verite style documentary, it still had some artistic choices mixed put into it, which also don't take away from the. I think the filmmakers take a very political stance. I think that also takes away from the documentarian. I'm sure that takes away from the verite spirit also, right? I'm a little confused on where that is. I also, because I've seen I saw articles about Menchu's testimony also being inconsistent in the lead up to this call.
One of
So
the issues with the cinema verite movement is uh, uh, from the 70s, and mostly owing to the philosophical influences back then, it became clear that you cannot really have an objective view on any issue. It's mostly a well researched subjective view. I think that started to reflect in some sense in the newspaper articles as well, because newspapers were mostly considered to be in some sense objective and very indiscriminate in the way they portray information. But it was not the case. It was not the case before, and it was only a realization that it cannot ever be a case in any circumstance. It will always be a reference frame from where uh, you look at the sequence of events.
right, yeah. And it also got me thinking, like, how objective can an outsider be to something, to an event like this, right?
Um,
What kind of what kind of moral choices or what kind of choices go into making such a film of such a theme or nature or whatever? I've read
consider
about this with respect to like war journalists and war photographers and how they are also compromised in a way, in a morally speaking, when it comes to depicting these things on film.
okay. So I'm not entirely sure if it requires a local perspective to, I mean, a local filmmaker to strongly highlight a local perspective. For example, if we are thinking about the Afghanistan war, sometime in 2005, when Bush was still the president, and it was seen like it was a triumphant success. All in all, none of the failures and none of the shortcomings were in any way highlighted, except for a few whistleblowers and a few intellectuals who kept insisting that this is not a sustainable practice, and this is not something that will work out for the long term. One of them being Noam Chomsky.
Hmm.
So um, you had you yeah, even if you're thinking about Afghanistan, you have you have varying perspectives to a particular event. Taliban fighter might see it differently. An Afghani citizen who is in the majority might see it differently. So it mostly falls on research and the lack of it. I mean, research on the issue and the lack of it. For example, Ben Anderson, despite the limitations, has managed in some sense to bring out a sense of objectivity in the from the war. His film, "This Is What Winning Looks Like." It was.
Okay.
It's not a feature film. It's a documentary film. It's a wise collaborated documentary film. I mean, it can be. We can think about how there is an obvious collusion with the government, and there is an obvious collusion with corporates that have something at stake here, uh, and that is the usual problem with big budget uh, documentary productions, or film productions for that matter. You won't have that sense of objectivity. It's lost. I mean, we lost it with the realization that we cannot be objective in any way.
Yeah. Okay. Supreet, do you have something to add?
Hello? Yeah. Okay. I don't think I've had really, but I had a question. You're talking about the cinema verite and the cinema concept, right? So I wanted to know, like, if it's possible, like, do you have any mainstream movies or any movies which actually show direct perspective, like say here, for example, we had a bit of a political view. If I'm not mistaken here, a bit of a political view. It was subtle, sure, but it was a bit political. We didn't have like from all classes for kind of view. So is it something we just have a normal life kind of thing, normal documentary which shows like on both sides of the story? Just one quick question here. I remember seeing one in Jirga or something. It was a Afghan film in 2018. Uh, like an Australian Navy SEAL goes back to Afghanistan to live with the family, you know, to help a family who he had accidentally killed. Or something happened during the war. That's what I remember. But is there any other examples of such? No, without any biases. Like you show both sides of the story and just give the viewers to have their own opinions.
Um, no, documentaries, I don't know what. I mean, nothing comes to mind immediately. I think some of Werner Herzog's works tend to have this kind of, uh, I would call it a bone chilling sense of objectivity, but like the early ones, like uh, Grizzly Man and so on. But in this, I mean, in
Romance
this,
Anarchy also has, the it has elements of the, the cinema verite movement, but it doesn't really reflect upon.
yeah, yeah,
You have Abbas Kiarostami. I mean, Close Up was a excellent docufiction.
yeah, and then there are, I think, hyperlink films also tend to do this, right? Where they tend um, this Inarritu's early films come to mind, where he tends to Babel in particular, because uh, in that film he consciously had three stories told from three different classes, social, socioeconomic classes. I'm sure there are like a lot more examples. Nothing comes up immediately. Uh, but it's not unheard of. That's I can add to that.
If you're talking about, um, the elements of these characteristics of these documentaries, in some sense picked up by feature films and explored further, then you have a class of films. If you're talking about films that try to stay objective to the historical narrative, you have one documentary. I mean, one class of films. So uh, two different issues, two different uh, directions with your question,
Yeah,
actually.
I mean the format.
Yeah, and I think it'll be very fruitful if you study filmmakers who started out in documentaries and then switch to feature films, because that way you'll be able to connect these dots a lot better. Uh, Famously, I think Nolan was one, Rajiv Ravi, I think Inaritu also. Uh,
Oh, Yerito
so
started out with documentaries. Okay.
Inaritu spent a whole decade assisting people, or I mean, assisting other filmmakers and growing under their tutelage. And a lot of those productions involved documentary work.
Okay, so even the Iranian filmmakers also were initially documentarians and then feature filmmakers. Uh, Kiarostami and Naderi spent a significant amount of time, and also the person who made the cow. I don't remember the name.
The
It
cow.
was,
Uh,
it was actually a groundbreaking film in the Iranian film industry. I mean, that in some sense,
Danish Mehjui.
yeah,
Yeah.
it in some sense kickstarted the Iranian New Wave.
Hmm.
So you have, I mean, like I said, you usually with film movements you have some of these elements picked up, and it has they are interlinked in some fashion. Although the way they structure their narrative is what distinguishes one from the other.
Yeah. Some of these things are very subconscious approaches, right? Say if you and I were to make a documentary about, say, Bangalore's uh, Bangalore's crime culture, or I don't know, Bangalore's party culture, I don't know, something or the other, that some aspect of Bangalore tomorrow,
Mhm.
we would come at it at very different ways. I would come at it from an outsider perspective, while Nikhil would have a lot more. He would have his decisions, the decisions he take, or the creative decisions he take will be a lot more personal in nature. They'll be a lot more informed by um, his lived experiences.
I
So,
wouldn't say informed, well informed, because it would again be mostly my perspective. So there was a conversation I was having with Arjun, who is also in the film club. I think you might be familiar with him
huh,
in the topic group.
yeah,
So we were talking about how Bangalore doesn't really have an identity of its own. It's just it just grew out of around
yeah,
money. It didn't really engage with uh, a particular architecture. It didn't really engage with a particular cultural style with the way it was brought up. And in some sense, I feel it's good, wherein you don't really have a dominant culture, and the subservient cultures in the periphery. You have no identity, which makes it all the more fluidic. You don't have a particular style with the architecture. You don't have a particular yeah, uh, cultural heritage, as opposed to a lot of other princely and
mm,
historically populated cities. And the perspective that I would give is mostly from it would mostly have some reflections from where I stay, and what my upbringing was, and what my religious and caste affiliations are. But uh, uh, to a person who might be from a different caste, it might be a different city altogether. It might be it might be a person from a different lingo group might perceive it differently. So I feel the distinguishing factor is mostly between well researched and poorly researched. Uh, you know, uh,
yeah,
uh,
definitely, yeah,
documentaries. I think this happened with one of Ken Burns' documentaries itself. I mean, he's known to put a lot of rigor into his research, but nevertheless, he cut short on a lot of atrocities by the U.S. Army, particularly the massacre, which was sort of a defining moment for the pacifist movement in back in the United States.
mm,
Mm, I don't remember the name of the massacre, but it was a very defining moment, and surprisingly, none of the no, nobody was convicted of anything.
okay,
So
but
I mean, that is that going back. That is what I want to. That is what I feel distinguishes a really good documentary from a poorly made documentary. For example, Pamela Yates, probably considering her surname, has nothing to do with the Mayan civilization.
yeah,
Culturally or ethnically, but her uh, um, her fascination and her dedication for the genocide and not for the events of the genocide and her rigor in exploring the issue, it gave a fairly different dimension. It could be